心之距離是一個鄭永熙在2020年設計的投影藝術裝置。這設計源自於思鄉之情，所以設計暫時擺放在他的家裡。設計包括4個同樣大小的正方形擺設，形成一個心形。基隆拿與香港的影片散佈2個角落，代表着雖然兩地有顯著嘅距離，但仍然有不同嘅媒體把兩地嘅距離拉近。日常生活的影片、視頻對話的鈴聲、朋友的笑聲此起彼落，打斷了平淡的氣氛。4個角落迅速換上朋友與家人打招呼和笑容，正是表達思鄉之情。
When I Smell Peaches by Manjinder Sidhu. When I smell peaches. You always made me open the fruit stand before I was ready, before the displays were set. You would joke, in life, when are you ever ready? Picking bin after bin, box after box, pound after pound. Your largest summer battles were with a fuzz that itched in the cracks of your brown hands. You could read them. You could tell their stories by weight. and you used to say, squeeze. Feel for the give, but know that there will be bruises, that marks exist under skin. Visible only when peeled, of course. You would create rows of peaches on the tables, the baton flicks of a seasoned conductor. These are ripe, you would say. Sell them quickly. My fluency in this language will die with you. Body as a Discarded Wall Plate by Manjinder Sidhu. The truth is that once there was someone who charmed you with words like shelter and shield, who etched the power of polish on your face, who filled the empty rectangular space of you. You held to their promise despite the screw they put right through the center of you, waiting for them to once again recall the want of you, wishing that despite the dark and mess of wire, that someone would uncover the spark held within the shape of you. I don't want to, but by Manjinder Sidhu. I don't want to, but I will teach my daughter how to balance all her fingers on her thumb. A bird beak hand before the push. She will shake her head. So I will show her how to squeeze the knuckles, to contract palms flush, to force the fit. I will nod my head. The body will always flush with this exertion, with this knowledge, for bangles, like babies, leave their own marks.
In 2015 and 16, I lived in a neighborhood in Calgary, Alberta, that prioritized the wetland that the community was built upon. I spent much time exploring the creeks and the ridge, and enjoyed encountering and observing the life forms that inhabited the space. I spent these years creating ink paintings expressing my lived experience of this local wildlife. The ink paintings I produced are heavily stylized and make use of universal and archetypal symbols rooted in the patterns I observed in nature. I created these paintings as a means of mental and spiritual introspection, where I would reflect on my completed work to learn more about myself. One significant finding was that I seemed to be subconsciously expressing my place experiences in a manner that seemed, to me, strangely and somehow very Japanese. I have never been to Japan. My Germanic mother and Japanese father had moved from Japan to Canada shortly before I was born. But Japanese was my first language, and I grew up on Japanese TV shows that my grandparents would record on VHS and mail to my family. I learned English when I started school, and spoke less and less of the Japanese language as the years passed. I felt as though there was less Japanese culture in me as I grew older. By the time I finished high school, I hardly identified with Japanese culture at all. And yet here I was, producing art that appeared Japanese. It occurred to me that perhaps my deeply ingrained way of knowing and way of being was more Japanese than I realized. For many years, I had been fascinated by Celtic and Germanic interlaces. In this body of work, I utilized non-structural knots to represent life and organic movement. A few years ago, I decided to trace the history of the use of knotwork in art, and discovered serpentine and interlacing forms in the art of the Zhou dynasty in China. And spirals and concentric circles, forms which I gravitated to, was prominent in traditional Japanese patterns. Although my paintings were done with fine point dip pens, 00 paintbrushes, sponges, and India ink, I made use of bold and rigid outlines or silhouette forms, which, upon reflection, imitated lines and shapes created by woodcut printmaking. Of course, woodblock printmaking plays a significant role in Japanese art history, notably the ukiyo-e. The flat and simplified forms of my paintings represent my impressions and memories. The way I experience a fleeting moment or remember an interaction in nature in my selective brain was never recalled or rendered in light and shadow, but rather through simplified and essentialized forms. The lack of depth in my flattened forms and spaces were probably influenced by my appreciation for Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and Art Nouveau. Interestingly, Japanese art played a notable role in influencing these movements, and now these movements were influencing me, as a sort of reverse Japanism. I initially thought my inclination for applying gold leaf was influenced by my fondness for medieval illuminations. However, looking at my gold leafing, it more closely resembles the gold leafing prominent in the Japanese screens of the Momoyama period and of Japanese decorative paper. This painting, titled Rabbit in the Snow, is based on an encounter I had late one night when I met a rabbit in the middle of the street. I admire the way these creatures, while lean and quick, could bunch themselves up and look cozy while still being ready to take off at any moment. This abstracted depiction of a rabbit illustrates how the rabbit's limbs and muscles were all tensed and ready to run. I was later asked why I felt the need to include the moon in the image, and if it had anything to do with the Japanese folktale of the moon rabbit that pounds mochi, which, of course, was entirely unintentional. This painting was inspired by the first spring morning of the year. As the sun began to rise, I had my bedroom window cracked open, and I could hear the birds singing. Beside my window was a large spruce tree, and a couple of magpies were busy building a nest in it. I wanted to paint my impression of the singing birds, but once I finished the painting, I realized I had painted the magpies instead. Although the title of the piece, The Sun is Rising, was intended to reference the spring morning, the title, as well as the composition of the piece, seems to vaguely evoke a Japanese flag. In this painting, titled Birch Trees, I wanted to depict my feeling for how all things in nature felt alive and filled with spirit. The trees depicted in this painting show eye-like forms where scarring on the bark occurs from self-pruning. Despite the human species considering itself to be superior to other species, observing these trees made me feel as though the trees knew a lot more than they let on. The fragmented background of pink versus green portrays the way these trees seem to exist in more than one reality or dimension. Despite being raised in a Christian household, my environmental views seem to fit with Shinto beliefs.
I would like to present an excerpt, the first third of an essay entitled White Space. In this essay, white space takes on equal importance as the words on the page. Exercise 1. Consider the white space in the following passage. A woman is powdering her nose in a diner on her shift as a server. A man walks into the restaurant, pulls out a .38 revolver, fires 8 times, and kills her. This man then kills himself. He has another gun, a .32 automatic, taped to his wrist. At an inquest, a coroner declared him temporarily insane. The Commonplace book as an inspiration. I read it described as an analog Pinterest, a scrapbook that encompasses both text and image. Quotations, poetic fragments, drawings, journal entries, recipes. One takes a look at the Commonplace book an artifact of a life in thought and aims to recreate the diffusion of inquiry. Block quote. A significant but undetermined number of people in the larger society, particularly those who occupy the white space, typically look on with disgust, pity, judgment, and fear. Their visions and assessments often ignore the impact of structural poverty and racism on the inner city ghetto, and many become inclined to blame the residents themselves for living that way. The White Space by Elijah Anderson. Scene. This must be the whitest place in the city, I tell a friend in a punk rock club in Vancouver. What do you mean by that? I ask myself later. It's located in an area of town that was the poorest and nonetheless, while white, also disproportionately indigenous. Outside the club, we have to snake around the groups of people who linger around Hastings Street, hunched over in hoodies. Other times, people slump in sleeping bags in front of the closed storefronts. Yet inside, here the milieu is white, the activity is white, the music is white. I brought my friend here to keep me company as a former student's band plays. A half pipe eats up a third of the space between the band and bar where we watch the performance. When his band starts, some audience members grab their boards and begin riding the half pipe. In my 40 years in Vancouver, I've seen the complexion of neighborhoods change alongside the mental fencing that has kept me envious in some places and in awe in others and fearful still in others. I like to think that I've been here long enough to melt into the background. Reflection. Now, when I go out in the evening, I am more likely to run into students than friends who are at home with their families or have been priced out of the city. At the end of the night at the punk club, I see yet another student, this time from a decade earlier, who reminds me that I gave her a very, very generous retroactive extension on a missed assignment that allowed her not to fail out of school. She mocked genuflex in front of me. What does it mean as someone non-white if you're in the white space? Do you colorize it, or does it leave you blanched? Exercise part 2. Compare the unredacted passage with the previous passage. A 20-year-old woman is powdering her nose in a diner on her shift as a server. A man walks into the restaurant, pulls out a .38 revolver, fires 8 times, and kills her. This man, 34 years old, then kills himself. Here's another gun, a .32 automatic, taped to his wrist. On his body, 2 letters to her were found. One featured a drawing of a man pointing a gun at a woman. Underneath this image was the caption, "If you don't love me, I shoot." At an inquest, a coroner declared him temporarily insane. White space upholds image over information. In the first half of the 20th century, Vancouver was a place of neon signs. By 1953, there were 19,000 neon signs in the city, second only in the world to Shanghai. That period saw the introduction of a chain of restaurants called the White Lunch. Its neon signage featured a steaming white cup, a tantalizing promise during the city's dark, wet winters. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
For more than 2,000 years, the story of the Weaver Woman has been told all over East Asia. A beautiful goddess transformed from the Vega star, the Weaver Woman has an important job in the heaven to weave the clouds. One day, she met a man who was the cowherd in the heaven, transformed from the altar star. Quickly they fell in love, they enjoyed each other's company so much, and spent day and night together. Weaver Woman simply forgot her job to weave. When there were no clouds, there was no rain, and people on the earth started to suffer from the drought. Animals were hiding from the heat, and the crops were dying without water. It did not take long for Weaver Woman's father, the Jade Emperor of the Heaven, to find out about this. He was very angry and decided to punish them. He sent the cowherd down to the earth to be born as an ordinary man in a very poor family. One day in the heaven was a whole year on the earth. The Jade Emperor ordered the Weaver Woman to stay at her chamber. Sad and lonely, she was not allowed to go anywhere. But since everyone was busy, she sneaked out and went down to the earth to look for the cowherd. Although the cowherd had no memory of his past life, they met and fell in love quickly again. They got married and started their lives together on the earth. But of course, the secret couldn't be kept for very long. The Jade Emperor found out about this and took Weaver Woman back up to the heaven, leaving the cowherd alone again. At this time, the cow accompanying him started to speak. My dear friend, we had been companions in the heaven and on the earth. I will help you to look for your wife. Take my skin, then you can fly to the sky. The cowhide became a cloak. The cowherd put it on and flew up to the heavens. As he was just about to reach the Weaver Woman, a big thunder came and separated them. At this time, the Milky Way was formed to keep them on the opposite sides. A flock of magpies flew by and took pity on them. These magical birds gathered together and formed a celestial bridge. Finally, Weaver Woman and the cowherd were able to walk across the bridge to meet each other. The Jade Emperor then decided to allow the couple to meet once a year if the magpies would come to make the bridge for them. The story of the Weaver Woman and the cowherd becomes the symbol for eternal love.
Memorialization, invisible labor, social justice, and traditions relative to my Japanese heritage represents a broad but interrelated constellation of ideas that are foundational to my work. An ongoing line of inquiry engages the invisible labor of immigrants and with focus on the labor history of my family. In 1952, my mother immigrated to Canada from Japan and shortly thereafter began working in the garment industry, making clothing for a sportswear company in Vancouver, British Columbia. Rather than being paid an hourly wage, she was paid a fixed rate for each hem that she sewed, also known as the piece rate system. In collaboration with my mother, we conceptualized a work that spoke to her experience in the sewing labor force during her early years in Canada. Piecework is a large-scale curtain of letter forms cut from clothing and then meticulously sewn together. A simple phrase, "I am here," is a repeating motif within the overall composition, which spans 7 feet in height and 28 feet in length. The repetitive forms establishes a rhythm suggesting to what it may feel like to perform this kind of work. Piecework is a symbolic gesture in reclaiming space, voice, and making visible invisible labor which often intersects with language. Harikyo is an annual ritual in Japan wherein artisans or anyone actively engaged in sewing will bring their needles to temples or shrines and lay them to rest in a soft bed of tofu as a way of expressing gratitude for these everyday objects. Alongside piecework is a small study or gesture of cultural transmission, a memorial for the old, dull, bent and broken needles used to produce this work.
我将自己视为一个容器，容纳着需要探索的宇宙，容纳着无边的荒野，容纳着让我成为自己的每一粒尘埃。宇宙无疑是一个谜，荒野充满着未知，尘埃无法被握住，带着存在在我身体容器里无数的未知，以及我所有的去看见、去感受那些使我成为自己的未知的碎片的好奇。我创作，如同我在探索自己的心灵，亦如同我存在着。
Hi Google. How are you doing today? Where are you right now?
Here's a map of Dilworth, Kelowna, BC.
Where is home?
Sign in to use your home address.
Where is your home?
Know Your Home Inspections is at Kelowna, BC.
Where is my home?
Sign in to use your home address.
How can I get back to China? Where is Henan?
Here's a map of Vernon, British Columbia.
Where is Henan?
Here's a map of London, United Kingdom.
How are you doing today? Where people go after they died.
This project aims to create a fully 3D and explorable virtual environment based on the masterful brushstrokes of traditional Chinese painting. My main inspiration for this piece was my grandfather's Chinese paintings. He is an exceptionally talented painter, painting in the traditional Chinese way. His works masterfully portray depth and the sheer vastness of the landscapes. Unfortunately, I have not had the chance to see many of his works as we reside on opposite sides of the world, but I still look up to his skill nonetheless. I also wanted this piece to have a more personal connection to myself and my family. With this in mind, I chose to try and emulate the area around my parents' hometown as much as possible. Deyang is a beautiful city and nature is intertwined with the surrounding area. I specifically chose the various hiking trails as the main inspiration. Paths lined with trees along rushing rivers and the various sounds of nature provide a truly blissful atmosphere.
Instead, I saw figures emerging from the fog. You waited for the sunrise, and it came from the other side. To have dreams as perfect as in real life, when no one has to leave and we all together see the sunrise.